Hello, everyone. This is Matt Kinsman, Head of Content at Connectiv. Welcome to Monetizing Podcast Techniques for Creating Consistent Revenue. Podcasts are taking media by storm, and B2B and association publishing are no exception. More brands than not have a podcast of some sort today, and last year the overall winner of Connectiv's Jesse H. Neal Awards, which honor the best in B2B media content, was a podcast. And that was Nobody's Home, a 10-part series produced by Source Media's American Banker that examined the vacant housing blight in the United States and was cited beyond B2B media by mainstream media outlets such as Politico and Axios. But while almost everyone has a podcast, including us here at Connectiv, few and far between are consistently monetizing those podcasts, including us here at Connectiv. Today, we're happy to bring you 3 different publishers who have cracked the code on monetizing podcasts, both directly and indirectly. You're going to hear some similarities on how they're able to secure sponsors and advertorials, but also differences in how they'll be monetizing podcasts long-term. Our speakers include David Kopp, publisher of HME Business and Mobility Management with 1105 Media, Peter Houston, co-host of the Media Voices podcast and who is graciously joining us this afternoon from the UK, and Keith Edwards, Vice President and Legal Market Leader at ALM. Remember to submit questions via the Q&A tab or unmute your line by hitting *7. And with that, David, please take it away.
Hi, everyone. Matt, thanks very much for having me, and thanks to Connectiv for having me. Again, my little bit of the presentation is fitting a podcast to your B2B media business. A little bit about me. I am a longtime editorial person in addition to publisher of the magazine, and I have wanted to do podcasts in a B2B format for a very long time since my wife bought me an iPod for Christmas one time. But I wanted to make sure that our media market was ready, both in terms of our audience and our advertisers. And so to do that, we really focused on making sure we were doing the right thing. We surveyed our audience, and we did qualitative kind of discussions with key advertisers, particularly those that are fond of new media alternatives or options, rather. And then once we were sure that we were doing the right thing, and we were definitely sure because 80% of our readers told us they wanted a podcast, we went out and did it, and did a huge promotional blitz in the print book, online, through email, et cetera, to start driving audience. And in fact, we continue to do that. I know that a lot of people in the audience might already have podcasts, but just to make sure for anybody who's in the audience who might still be at kind of square one, here's some information. Hosting the podcast, you want to use a podcast hosting service, and there are a mess of them out there. We use Libsyn. It's kind of, I think, a gold standard of podcast hosting, and it gives us a lot of great tools. And then you need to make sure that you have accounts with all the major listing services like iTunes, Stitcher, et cetera. And then you need to connect your hosting service with those listing services so that as you add podcasts, they get updated to the listing services like iTunes, et cetera. In terms of using those services properly, you want to make sure that you're using keywords. You have the option to use that, and that will help you grow audience in an asymmetrical fashion. You'll attract people that you might not have initially attracted to your publication through previous circulation efforts. And then once you get all set up, you should know that some of these listing services, such as iTunes, have their own expectations regarding their audience experience, because they do see your audience as much as their audience as well. And so they will have different requirements for your details and the sorts of things that get propagated to their listing service. So be aware of that. The big concern for me was editorial workflow. Podcasts do have a time impact. You have to do the time to set up the interviews, conduct the interviews, edit the podcast and get it posted, get the details out. That does take time. The key is to make it part of your editorial process, and that's what you need to work with on your editorial team. And there's some simple ways to do that. If people are doing a feature or something like that, it's very easy to make one of the interviews for that long-form feature a separate interview that can be repurposed towards the podcast. And then that's going to help you do promotion bidirectionally between the print and the online and your site and the podcast. The best way to get that started is to identify a champion on your editorial team and get them to dive into the implementation and then start to get everybody else trained up. This depends on the size of your editorial team, of course, but it is something that is probably the best option, is to have one internal champion that can start driving everybody else. And from a journalistic standpoint, because I still do a lot of writing for the book, in addition to my publishing duties, I can tell you that podcasts are marvelous. From a journalistic experience, they help me use the interviews that might otherwise wind up on the cutting room floor. It's also instant gratification. If there's something going on in the industry that I want to tap into, but I don't have the time to write a long piece about it, boom, I can get an interview done and put it on the podcast. For recording the podcast, real quickly, your Quickie Studio, you want a laptop, a good headphone, USB microphone, mic stand, pop filter, all that good stuff. For recording it, you want to use voice over IP as much as possible. I use a service called cleanfeed.net, not to be confused with cleanfeed.com. And then the key is to work with your sources and make sure that they understand the process of how the voice over IP discussion is going to go, and that they have the proper setup on their end, whether it's a USB microphone and a proper set of headphones, or if they're going to use maybe a hands-free that's Bluetooth, or you want to know what? Those iPhone headphones that everybody has, those work in a pinch. And then when your team is at a trade show or something like that, you can use the native recording app on an iPhone or an Android phone, and then just use a mini jack with an audio splitter and a couple cheap lav mics. Right here's a picture of the sorts of stuff that I use when producing the podcast and that my teammates use when putting together the podcast. In terms of editing the podcast, you need to strike a balance between speed and features. I care way more about speed. My team needs to get these things out so that we can monetize them. Two examples of audio editing software that you could use are Audacity. It's free, and it has tons of very powerful features. The problem is that it takes forever, in my opinion. So I use something called Hindenburg. It's expensive, but it is almost intuitive in the way it lets you edit audio. It is very fast. I can bring podcasts online, almost within an hour, I would say. Okay, a note about quality, because this will, impact how you monetize these podcasts. I care way more about getting these things done and online, but you do want to try and maximize the quality at all times. So it's a balancing act. And then you need to promote the podcast. This bullet point, I won't go through all these bullet points, but it's important to note that when you're starting a podcast and you're building an audience, promotion is everything. Because while you might have tons of subscribers to an e-newsletter service and your print publication and perhaps your digital issues, at the end of the day, you're starting a new product and you need to build audience. And the only way to do that, and the only way to capitalize on your existing circulations, is to do tons of promotion. Okay, so let's get into the monetizing. Who are your advertisers? What I would say is that what you want to do is go with people who already have existing online ad buys and see the value of new media, And that's important in a lot of markets. Not every B2B market has committed online advertisers. There are still some people who are very print-oriented holdouts, and I would say that you don't want to waste your money on those guys or your time on those guys. You want to focus on the people who are doing online media buys, who get online media, and who want to use every new thing that you're offering to them. The size of the companies doesn't matter. In my opinion, you want to look to people who pursue the quote-unquote new. And in that regard, my biggest back-page advertiser is one of those people, and also one of my smallest advertisers is one of those people, at least smallest print, I should say. But that particular company happens to really believe in new media, and even though they don't have as big a budget as other companies, they totally go after podcasts, they totally go after webinars, monetize social media, and other new platforms that we're doing. The other key is that you want people who get content marketing. You want advertisers who believe in value marketing. They want to attach the valuable information to their brand, and they want you to help them do that. That's the kind of platform you're creating. Those are the kind of advertisers, at least in my experience, in the B2B world that will support a podcast. People who get the value of business intelligence and business education. In that regard, we've got two core business models, and they are both based on sponsorship. One is sponsor copy reads, where you create X number of positions, so to speak, within your podcast where you can read an advertiser's sponsor copy. And then you also have the option to do entirely sponsored podcasts. And I want to underscore that these cannot be infomercials. They have to be a real online education, real online information. They're essentially the equivalent of an online long-form feature, and so your sponsor better deliver when it comes to the interview. In that regard, you want people who understand things like webinars, who understand good advertorial pieces, those sorts of people. They're the ones who are going to get, quote unquote, a podcast in that, a sponsored podcast in that format, and they're going to go after that. And when that works, it really works. And what I mean by that is my top podcasts in terms of downloads right now are sponsored podcasts. And that's because we took the time to work with the sponsor, develop the interview, really focus on the quality of content of the podcast interview, and then execute on that interview and put it in the podcast. And they've been a hit with readers. So it's proof that you can have sponsored media that resonates with your audience. In terms of pricing, now this gets a little weird because I'm a small guy. I imagine that there are people in the audience and people on this call, presenting on this call, that have advertisers with bigger ad budgets than I do. I'm in a weird little corner of healthcare, and my ad buyers only have so much money. But to give you an idea of scale, what we're charging, some of the signposts that we use to help us set our prices were like our webinars. Our podcast cost is about half the price of a webinar, a sponsored webinar. And it's about the price that we would have if we had a client who was hard bargaining on a full page of display advertising in the book, right? If they really chiseled us, the end result would be about the price that we charge for a podcast. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea. And then for the sponsored copy reads, those are cheaper. Those are in my world, and some people might chuckle, they're in the hundreds of dollars, but that's where it is. But you don't want to stop at just the sponsorship sale. You want to think about marketing services that you can attach to the podcast afterwards. And in that regard, one of the best things that we've come up with is something we call Viewpoint. And what we do is we take the audio of the podcast, we send it to a transcription firm such as Rev.com, and we have it transcribed for like $1 a minute. And then we take that interview and we turn it into a Q&A advertorial piece that we call a Viewpoint. This creates something that you can sell, again, in a variety of formats. It could be a PDF that users, that the audience goes out and downloads, and perhaps they enter information as part of a lead generation campaign. Or it could be an advertorial insert. Make it a hard insert that you put in the print book. There are different ways to sell that quote-unquote viewpoint product that we're calling it, and maximize the revenue per podcast. I guess the key I'm trying to underscore here is don't just think about the podcast. Your advertisers will ask you about statistics, and I don't want to take too much time on here because I'm gobbling up more than my fair share of the time. But the key here is that the world of podcast statistics are very limited. They're nothing like online media buying statistics. You'll see about the number of downloads, but you won't know, like say on YouTube, how you can see when people cut out. You don't see that with podcasts. You don't know. You don't have a lot of advertisers or a lot of answers to your advertisers' questions, so you want to manage their expectations based on that. And then lastly, some of my most recent lessons in monetizing podcasts and producing the podcasts is that this is an ongoing education. I'm sure that everything that I learn and that I think is highfalutin now will seem remedial 6 months from now. I will say this, if you have a regular schedule on the podcasts, give your readers a little something extra every now and then. Put in a bonus episode or something like that. That'll keep people charged up, keep people downloading. It won't become a grind. Also, when I do news stories on every podcast that I put out, I do promotions on every podcast that I put out. If your podcast hosting services has embed features, use those embed features. It'll increase your downloads. Seriously, you're building audience. You want to give people that taste every possible time you can. And then lastly, when you're doing any sort of promotions, when you're putting in details, try and tease with information. Don't get clickbaity, but if you've got somebody that's talking about a disturbing new trend in your industry, use that word, disturbing new trend. So with that, I'm going to yield my time. But if anybody has any questions, I am more than happy to answer them. I want a Johnny Appleseed podcast in the B2B media industry. The more that we all do it, the more it becomes a typical buy, and the more money that we'll all make in the long run, and the better off and the better served our readers will be. So anyway, that's about it. Just when you email me, make sure to put podcast webinar question in the subject line, and I'll hand things over.
David, thanks very much. Nice job. Folks, just a reminder, you can ask questions at any point. Just submit them via the Q&A tab in the lower left-hand corner of your screen, or you can unmute your line by hitting *7. Next up, we've got Peter Houston, co-host of the Media Voices podcast. Peter, take it away.
Thanks, Matt. And hello, everyone. Hi from a very wet, windy, and dark UK. It's the evening here, so joining you at a different time of day. So let me tell you about Media Voices. We're a weekly media industry podcast, and we pretty much cover any aspect of the business and media. So it could be newspapers, magazines, could be broadcast, not so much, but also a huge portion of our time is spent talking about online media, as you would imagine. Web, apps, and a lot about social media, particularly Facebook, Twitter, and then Google. I co-host with former colleagues from a London-based media news service called The Media Briefing. We as a business, got bought out by Haymarket. They just wanted to concentrate on our events, so Chris, Esther, and I went off on our own with the podcast. And I'm happy to say that today is our third birthday. This little slide shows our 100th episode logo, but we're actually now at 123 episodes, which I'm not sure what it is in dog years, but in podcast years, three years going is a long, long time. Most podcasts fade after about 7 episodes, and there's a really scary statistic that something like 3/4 of the podcasts on iTunes are actually moribund or dead. They haven't done anything in a long, long time. So we're quite proud of ourselves for keeping going. But we have an issue. In making money, the Media Voices podcast is a podcast of two halves. Let me tell you what I mean by that. We have a very well-behaved second half. The podcast is split in two, and in it lasts generally about maybe 40 minutes, 35 minutes, 40 minutes. And the last 20, 25 minutes are usually an interview, or they're pretty much always an interview unless we do a special on a single topic. So the second half is a very professional, very well put together interview with someone that most people would recognize from the media. We've talked to people from Condé Nast, The Guardian, Hearst, the list there, The Economist. This week we have the executive editor for Vice, Dori Carr-Harris. Our best ever interview was with Wired's editor-in-chief. I mean, by best, I mean most listened to, was by Wired's editor-in-chief, Nick Thompson. You know, from that point of view, who wouldn't want to sponsor a podcast like that? Well, the issue we got is that it is a podcast of two halves. And the first half is our snarky first half. It's us talking for 15, 20 minutes about what's happened in the media world the week that we're dealing with. And for a B2B podcast, we're pretty snarky. I have been particularly known to swear a lot. I'm Scottish. I think it's genetic. It's something we grew up with. We've been known to make fun of some of the decisions that the publishers that we talk about or the media owners we talk about have made. One of our favourites is to talk about centralised newsrooms. And anyone that tries to position that as a quality move, we talk about it as a cost-cutting move. I guess the point is we're really honest. We have strong views and we share them. We've even been known to poke fun at certain politicians. Our very own Boris Johnson gets stick on a regular basis. Your president, as you can imagine, gets stick on a regular basis. And we end almost every episode with a shout of "Stop Brexit." So you can tell sort of where we're coming from. And that kind of makes us a little bit not brand safe, if you like. Depending on where your brand sits in the world, you probably wouldn't want to sponsor one of our episodes. Having a read in among us, maybe making fun of a business strategy might not be the best way to go. We could clean our act up, we could stick to the script, but it's a labour of love, and we decided that we needed to have fun doing it, or what was the point? Because money in podcasts is a new thing. We've been doing this for 3 years. At the beginning, there was absolutely no money, and we did it because we loved doing it. To be honest, that's one of the things I think our audience likes about the podcast. They like the fact that we sound like we're having fun. They like the fact that we sound like we care. We're unfiltered, which can cause problems from a monetization point of view, but from an audience point of view, we offer a fairly straight take on an industry that I'm sure everyone would agree can be packed with bullshit at some times. So, in-episode sponsorship is probably not a good way for us to go. Read-throughs or mid-rolls or whatever you want to call them is probably not a good way for us to go. Our numbers are growing. We don't want to mess with that. So we had to come up with some alternatives because we are not independently wealthy. We do need money. We're waiting on a philanthropist to come along and say this is brilliant, but no one has yet. So we had to come up with some alternative revenue sources. Now, I should say at this point, we're a small outfit. We're 3 people. We do this alongside our day jobs. But I think some of the things that we've come up with, I hope some of the things that we come up with could be used by any publishing outfit. And certainly listening to David, some of the things he said really resonate with where we're at. So if I could just walk you through the 3 alternative revenue sources that we have at the moment. A big one really is what we call Media Voices Conversations. And these are sponsored episodes, just as David described. And we distribute these separately from our weekly episodes. They appear in the same feed. We post them on the same website, but they're completely separate episodes. And what they are really is a conversation around a problem. We have our own host, we have a sponsor, and then we have a guest. And the guest is usually a client of the sponsor. So, for example, our first the first one we ever did was, as David said, a very small advertiser, a local sales training organization, but they managed to bring in the sales manager from, ex-sales manager from Informa Publishing, massive B2B publisher, a lot of trade shows now. So we had a fairly high-profile guest on, although it was a very small sponsor. And then the one that we're looking at next time out is hoping to bring someone in from News Corp. So they're a vendor who does work for News Corp and from some massive publishing organizations. And they'll bring in someone from one of these big organizations. Other ones have been programmatic managers from UK publishers. And the other one was a former Wall Street Journal circulation manager who's now working with a slow news startup called Tortoise. So the idea behind this is to get a real problem and to get someone who has real experiences dealing with that problem and the vendor potentially who's helped them with that. And it's, again, as I say, the idea is that it's a real conversation around a real problem, and if anyone gets too pitchy, we say that we'll cut that out. I think that's to what David's point, he talked about real information. That is key. This is absolutely about content marketing. That's really the package that we put together because, again, as David said, it's not just about the podcast, it's what you can do around about it. So we'll host the episode at least 6 months. We put it on our website, voices.media. It has its own page. Sponsor logo goes on that page, links to their website. We even link to white papers if they want us to. We put it in our newsletter, put it in for a couple of weeks. We put it on our social media feeds, and we do a transcript that we make available. And if they want that designed, we can charge them extra for that. The idea, though, is it's not just that podcast. It's about creating an event around the podcast. The podcast, in some ways, is just the excuse. So the next thing we do is we leverage our profile. We talk to some fairly serious people on a regular basis, and we leverage that access and the reputation that we have for talking to these people into an analysis product. We do this every year. Annual industry report sponsored by Sovereign, who's an ad exchange, distributed with a website called What's New in Publishing. And we do it's a work for hire. We get paid a fee to do this. We write 8 sections. 2019 report is being written at the moment. And this is really just leveraging the credibility and the reputation that we've managed to build through the podcast. And I think if you've already got a publication, you'll be doing this kind of thing, but the podcast may allow you to take it in a slightly different direction. It might be your excuse to do something just a little bit different. And then the newest revenue stream is our awards program. We launched the Publisher Podcast Awards really to service our audience base. The people that listen to us are publishers. Some of them have podcasts. The people that we interview every week have podcasts. And we wanted these awards as a way to try and celebrate the work that they were doing, also to make some money. So we launched this for next year. Entries close this week. Actually, we just extended, as all awards programs do. Entries close next week. We have 10 categories, and our audience is entering their podcasts. And we've had some incredible entries so far. From publishers that you would absolutely recognize, internationally recognized publishers. And the nice thing about that is that it then lets us leverage that into sponsorship opportunities and obviously table sales, just as you would with any of the events, programs that you have yourself. You can just add a new one to your portfolio specifically around the podcast. If you have in an industry, if there's podcasts that people are doing inside your industry, and I think more and more people will be doing their own podcasts, their own content marketing efforts, then I think that's something else that people can leverage into their own awards programs. So just to sum up, in terms of the takeaways, as I described, as we're a small outfit. There's 3 of us. We do this alongside our day job. But I think what we've come up with is a formula I hope that any publisher could really apply, because it's all about leveraging the buzz that you create. And one of the things that I think, I've seen articles recently about peak podcast. I think if you're doing a true crime podcast, that might be true. If you're doing a B2B podcast and you're in a niche, that is absolutely not true. And you can leverage the buzz that you'll get from the podcast to do some things that I think will get you attention, and that attention you can translate into revenue. Consider the podcast as a brand extension, the same way you would with a magazine, but then consider extensions to the podcast, same way you would naturally. Does it fit with the audience? Does it add value to the advertising base? Really think how you can build, just use that podcast almost as an excuse to build out some other products, like that transcript idea that David talked about, or the awards that we were talking about, or reports. The big thing, I think, is to stay smart. If you're not adding value, then very quickly people are going to ignore your podcast. There's millions of podcasts out there, and people will get bored and they'll move on. Just like they will with your publication, just like they will with your newsletters, just like they will with your website. You've got to keep it interesting. You have to add value. But I think the big thing, really, I would say, is if you can't monetize your podcast directly, and there's lots of ways to do that. You know, you can have read-throughs, you can put it on an ad exchange and have programmatic in your podcast. You can do all sorts of stuff. But I think for B2B particularly, it doesn't need to be that. It can be in association with your newsletters, it can be with transcripts, it can be with whatever it is that you can add on, but it's still revenue. And all you're really doing is using the podcast as an excuse. Definitely see it as part of your bigger portfolio. Don't see it as a separate product. And with that, I will hand over or answer any questions.
Peter, thank you very much. Folks, we're going to move on to our third speakers. You can certainly submit questions at any time, and we'll have a formal Q&A after the third presentation. But next up, we have Keith Edwards, Vice President and Legal Market Leader with ALM. Keith, you might have to hit *7.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, terrific. Sorry about that. Hi, everyone. My name is Keith Edwards. I'm the legal market leader here at ALM. Dean Musio was not able to be here this afternoon, but I'm thrilled to talk about our podcast program. Let me give you on the next slide just a little overview about who ALM is. We are 30 brands in reaching 6 million professionals in different industries around the country and really around the world. And on the next slide, I'll just get in a little bit about our best practices when we talk about podcasting. But just to back up a little bit, I run the legal markets for ALM. And so, we have a couple big editorial podcasts that we are really proud of and how they've grown over the years. The legal one is called Legal Speak. I can assure you that it is not quite as entertaining as Peter's podcast. However, it has tripled in the last, we started monetizing it in April of 2018, and so we're real pleased with the performance of that. We have another one in Think Advisor called Human Capital. So we have different podcasts that cater to our different industry segments. We're often asked out in the field, what do we need to know if we're going to launch a podcast, a custom podcast? And so on the slide here that you see are really our 4 best practices that we use as a guideline for clients and also for our editorial teams here at ALM. The first is brevity. Average time people spend with a podcast is 22 minutes. Legal Speak runs on average 23 minutes. So we try to practice what we preach and keep things as brief as we can, and that's among those who listen to at least 5 minutes of a podcast. The second one's schedule. We say if we're going to do a podcast, let's do it the same day each week. The third thing is plan ahead. We don't want to put all of our creative efforts into the debut issue and then try to figure out what we're going to do. To do any podcast, we really see that as at least a 4 or 5 episode commitment before we start that. And that goes for any custom pieces that we do with our clients as well. We try to get them to think about that as well. And finally, proactively market. This is not an if you build it, they will come. We really have to build an audience, as we've heard from the other speakers. It's something that we focus on building that audience. On the next slide here, I'll just touch on, we see this as a growing area. 2/3 of B2B marketers, according to eMarketer, are actively considering a podcast. So the time is right, and projections for growth look really good in the market. 26 minutes is the average commute time in the United States, which dovetails very nicely with the average listen time on a podcast. And when we look over at the consumption, really podcasting is a multitasking product. People are, when we ask them, what are you doing when you are listening to a podcast, they're not sitting and only doing that. They're usually commuting, riding transportation, working out, walking around, doing something else around the house. So it's really, we find that they're doing something while they do it. So it's just important from an engagement perspective. On the next slide, I want to get into ad revenue. And, according to the projections that we have seen from PwC listed here, we have a stat, we're looking at a 40% growth in overall investment in podcasts year over year for 2019 since 2018. So it is a definite growing segment of the market. Most of the ads we find are buying quarterly. So 38%, it's a quarterly investment. And our takeaway from that is that we wanted to build our monetization strategy to mirror that. The other thing that we really focused on, and I know that David touched on this as well, is really those host-read ads are the majority of what people are investing in according to the IAB. So that's 63% of the revenue. Very little client-supplied advertising. And in fact, I don't think we've ever had one where a client has sent us a recording. It's really, they want that word of mouth. That was always the value proposition from a marketing perspective of talk radio, and podcasts are the same way. It's that trusted advisor talking about the client's brand. On the next slide, we have really three things that we hear and see in the market that we address with our podcast offerings. The first thing is that clients will say, hey, I've got this podcast we started. We want to reach a broader audience. Second, we will have clients ask our teams to help them produce a custom podcast. They have heard about the great growth in podcasts. They aren't quite sure how to do it. And then the third thing is they want to get thought leadership and exposure on some topic, and we happen to have a podcast that would work for them. And so on the next slide these are the client objectives, and then these are what we serve up to those different clients. So the first one is what we call a client-supplied podcast, and that is where ALM Marketing Services will help build scale to a podcast that a client has spent time and money investing in. I work in the legal space, and many are, for instance, law firms. They have invested a ton of time in getting senior partners to participate in their own internal podcasts. We can then take that and help them get an audience for that great content. The second one is, client custom podcasts, and we again focus on at least a regular series of podcasts. So we really try to not do these as one-offs. So if you want to come in and do a client custom podcast with us, that's great, and we're happy to do that and help, and we can host it. There are lots of different. It really is a custom piece, but we try to keep them to those best practices of 22 minutes, and we start with 6 episodes. And then the third is, of course, our editorial podcasts, Legal Speak, our Human Capital, our different podcast products, and that's where we will read ads in those. And then the next slide is where we really get into, I'll just break down kind of the price points for those three. David, I did quick math when you mentioned that you charge half of a webinar. We charge 48% of our webinar price for our editorial podcast. So we are right in line with what you mentioned. And that is, these are all relative, obviously. The larger podcasts are a little bit more expensive, but this is essentially how these three programs compare. The editorial podcasts are the least expensive, and then a client custom podcast series is the most expensive. And the client supply piece is kind of somewhere in between. And we build a lot of minimums. So a client supply podcast, we require that be a 3-month minimum. And then for a custom piece, that's also a 3-month minimum with, again, that minimum series. And then finally, on the last slide here that I have is just how we market our podcast programs. We can go to the next one. Yeah. So, it depends on the elements of a given podcast, how we go to market with that and help drive engagement. But we really use these kind of 4 different platforms to offer value to the sponsor. So I would say for the first one, to drive listeners' engagement, we have an ALM podcast page on our site where we kind of advertise and allow people to stream any podcasts that we produce on our site, and then also drive links back to wherever you download your favorite podcasts. Obviously, I use Apple, but as I think most people do. And then we have 4 different ways that we kind of drive value to sponsors in terms of marketing promotion. First one is native. We can take a podcast and attribute it to a sponsor and run it in our news stream. We do a lot of on-site banner pieces as well, where we'll say, hey, click here to check out Legal Speak or any of the custom pieces. So we'll just do kind of run of network banners to help drive that engagement. The third thing listed on here is what we call audience first, which is using ALM's first-party data to do programmatic off-brand targeting. So we will not only promote on on-site banners, but we'll also do banners across the general brand safe internet against these different professional segments to help drive engagement. And then finally, topical editorial placements within the newsletter has been a big performer for us. So we have a lot of vertical newsletters, from the legal space and et cetera, and we will place the newsletter that we are promoting within that editorial newsletter. And that's been really effective for us. So again, this is just kind of a very brief overview of what we see happening at ALM, but we're obviously very excited about this. It's a definite growth area for us and a definite source of big investment here.
All right, Keith. Excellent job. Folks, we're going to open this up for a Q&A. We have a couple questions already lined up in the Q&A tab. If you have a question, please type your question in under the Q&A tab and submit either to broadcast to all or to all co-presenters. You can also ask your question over the phone line by hitting *7 to unmute your line. First question, guys, I'm going to address to all of you and ask each of our speakers to weigh in on this. The question is, we are starting from square one, advice on where and how to connect with potential advertisers. I think that's an interesting question because I think we've heard from some Connectiv members, even those with very established digital media businesses, when they bring up podcasts, their advertisers have no interest. So any beginning advice, steps you can recommend for initiating that conversation with potential advertisers?
This is Dave. I've got a couple. One, going back to the reader survey, I think that's critical. Your reader survey is going to help create a comfort level with your advertisers. And just as a quick thumbnail, when we did our survey, we found that about 48% of our readers were already listening to podcasts sort of in their personal life or their professional life. But that left out, 52%. But then when we asked the question, if HME Business, that's my primary title, launched a podcast, would you listen to it? And more than 80% of the respondents said yes. And that's all the respondents, including the people who don't listen to podcasts. So if you have results like that in a reader survey and you take that to advertisers, they will think twice. They're going to go, oh, there's an audience here that I'm going to miss out on. And then with that, going back, and then the other thing, like going back to what I said, is to take a look at, say, your top 20 online advertisers. People who believe in things like custom e-newsletters, people who believe in things like webinars, especially the webinar buyers, people, if you have the social media campaign or social media products, people who are buying those are going to be people who would be interested in podcasts.
Hi, it's Peter. I think one of the things that is important to do is try and speak to the people that you get on well with, that you've got I think, as David said, some of the guys that you've got custom digital products with already, but also people that you can have a real conversation that allows you to manage expectations. I think so many people, when they hear about podcasts, they think about, mattress adverts or Blue Apron or whatever, and they particularly in the B2B space, they're going to think, well, this is not for me, this is a consumer channel. I think if you can have a real conversation and talk about, that engagement that you get from podcasts, the idea that you're directly into someone's ears, you've got a one-to-one conversation going on with that listener, then I think maybe you can start talking about how powerful this can be.
I agree a lot with Peter, and I think that to build on that, when we are talking with clients, any new thing they go, oh my gosh, are we going to have the resources internally to execute that? And so I think about illustrating for them how easy it can be to have copy handed to our host and read. It's really a very low, it's easier than even running a banner ad somewhere. And the second piece is, to Peter's point, this mimics word of mouth. Many advertisers, especially in the legal space, who are hesitant to advertise at all, they say, well, we get a lot of business from word of mouth. This feels a lot like word of mouth. It's an endorsement from our host.
All right, terrific. Guys, next question is around custom podcasts. I know each of you had talked a little bit about the opportunity around custom podcasts. Question is, how do you reliably deliver an audience for a limited run custom podcast? We've been resistant to that route due to slow but steady pace of growth of our primary programs and steps involved to get listed on third-party platforms.
Hi, it's Peter. We avoid this by putting our Conversations episode out as part of our regular feed. So we basically piggyback our regular audience. It's a Media Voices Conversations episode, but it's not a Media Voices Weekly episode, but it's part of our regular feed, so we piggyback. I definitely see the issue. If you were doing a series like the Nobody's Home season, then I think you have an issue. I guess the best way to get the audience for that is going to be using your existing newsletters, using your website, using your print and advertising it. It's really going to be just really everything you can do to promote it to your existing audience. But it's a tough one. It definitely is.
Yeah, this is Dave. From my perspective, this is a problem I would like to have because it speaks to a larger circulation and audience than I currently have. But if I were presented with that challenge, I think that what I would do is probably try and keep it within the core podcast, but make them perhaps bonus episodes or something like that, if you could leverage the existing audience. But if it's about creating a whole new audience, that's a whole other kettle of fish.
We at ALM use, the slide that we use to promote custom podcasts is actually still on the screen. So we use all of these kind of touch points. We have also in the past done a little promotional ad on our editorial podcast. So we will have, for instance, the host of Legal Speak say, hey, check out, if you're interested in XYZ topic, check out this podcast available on iTunes and on the ALM podcast page. But we try to cross-promote as much as we can and then use these newsletter placements, have everything housed in the same area so that people who are coming to the site and looking at podcasts will find any that we produce.
Very good. Next question talks a little bit about editorial control with a custom podcast. If an advertiser sponsors an entire podcast, do they typically want to hear it first or even have editorial control over the content?
On my end, because this is probably how I drive most of my podcast revenue currently, we do send it back to the the media decision maker and the people who are involved in the interview. But I will say this is that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Before we even conduct that interview, we've done so much hashing of the interview and outlining of the interview and revisions of questions and what the person's going to say without making it sound scripted, of course. But it's still a conversation. But we've done so much to try and hone what we're going to talk about from the outset that we haven't had a dissatisfied customer yet.
Peter, we definitely send it to the advertiser. I mean, I guess it's the same way as you would if you made an advertorial issue or a kind of supplement. I think it's the same process. The one thing I would say is we don't give them editorial control. If they ask us to take something out, then we'll consider that if they see it, if they're misspeaking or it's a problem that they see. But if it's something that we think adds value to the whole package, then we'll argue about it. We haven't had to do that yet, though. People really see the value in proper and educational informed content. So it's less of an issue, I think, than maybe you would worry about.
I would agree, and we also have that option that they can produce their own podcast and we can just promote it. So if it is an issue where they really want total control, we just help. Then they can build it themselves and we can help promote it. So we happen to have that tool.
Folks, we've got a couple minutes left, so if you do have a question, please go ahead and get that in now. For our speakers, our next question really talks about managing expectations with advertisers. And the question is, I read a stat somewhere saying that the average number of downloads for B2B podcasts is less than 200. That will sound low to our advertisers. How do you address this in sales?
That's where I live. The key with that is I think that is true. That our podcasts are starting to get up over the 200 mark as the audience comes to the podcast. But I think that this and in the B2B sales world, this is why those sponsored podcasts mean so much. Because those audience sizes are analogous to webinar sizes. We'll do a webinar. We'll get say 350 registrants, and maybe the actual when the webinar hits is let's say 150 or 200. Well, that's about the size of a podcast. So now the pitch is, well, hey, you're getting webinar quality marketing. Webinar quality content marketing, and you're getting a webinar audience size, but you're getting it for half the price of a webinar. So when you put it in those terms, then they start to see the value.
It's Peter. I was going to say that I don't know. Those numbers look absolutely possible to me. We do more than that, but I think the issue, again, is managing expectations. A podcast audience is more engaged than a newsletter audience, for example, and I think it's making that point. One of the things that we've managed to do with the podcast, the sponsored podcast, is when we've built in a white paper download, that the downloads compared to the size of the audience are insane. They're really, really high. And we've had the advertiser that sponsored that podcast talk to other advertisers. We're sort of using them to provide testimonials. But you're right; you definitely have to manage expectations.
I know we launched a custom podcast just this past week in the real estate space, and we were very excited with 500 immediate downloads on the first episode. So, but I think that's a high result. I think that I like David's point. It's very similar to what we would get for a webinar, and so that's kind of our benchmarks for expectations for clients.
Yeah, and the nice thing about podcasts is that they're just to add to that is that unlike a lot of webinar solutions where the webinar lives out there for let's say 5 months or 3 months or something like that, a podcast is out there basically forever as long as it's being hosted. So that's another another value that can be communicated to the advertiser.
Folks, we're almost out of time. If you have another question, please get it in right now. Guys, I have a question. We talked a lot about advertising and sponsorship of podcasts. I'm just curious if there's any paid content subscription opportunity with podcasts, particularly as you repurpose podcasts from webinars or events or tie this into research or even a white paper. Do you see any kind of subscription opportunity moving forward?
I think in the future, if you've got real expert content, the legal content would be interesting, I think. But if you've got something that people are going to pay for, if you've got a paid text offering, then I don't see any reason why you couldn't have a paid podcast offering. Right now, I guess the numbers are still pretty low, so I don't know what the revenue would be, but I definitely think there's an opportunity there.
We see it as an opportunity at ALM to build in with our, paid content is obviously a huge area of our business. I will tell you the bar associations do not allow continuing legal education credit for podcasts yet. We are working on that and working with some of the bar associations, but they are pretty conservative when it comes to what they'll give CLE credit for. But we see that as a big opportunity for paid content, is if lawyers can actually get credit for listening to a 1-hour podcast. That would be a big game changer in the space in terms of paid content. But for now, that'll be a slow change.
Can I ask you a question? What's the mechanism that you guys would use for that? Would it be Stitcher?
We currently have CLE videos on our CLE Center. I'm not sure which platform would be the best for it. It would have to be one where we can guarantee that the user actually listened to the entire podcast, which has been the barrier for it. So, any traditional podcast, to my knowledge, we can't verify that they played the entire thing.
Exactly. Yeah, that's because CEUs are important in my marketplace as well. It's healthcare.
Yeah.
And so,
yeah.
That's what I'm curious.
All right, terrific. Folks, unfortunately, we are out of time, and we're going to have to stop the webcast now. I am going to follow up with a replay and decks from this presentation, and I'll be distributing that. For those of you who have additional questions, you can see email addresses for some of our speakers in the decks. You can also follow up with me, send a note to my email, and I'd be happy to coordinate you with the speaker. Thank you very much to our speakers. They did a terrific job today, particularly to Peter, who's dialing in from Scotland, and then also Keith, who joined us as a replacement last minute today. Thank you very much. Terrific job. Before we let you guys go, just a shameless plug about some things coming up at Connectiv. December 3rd, we have our Connectiv Digital Media Council meeting in Chicago. It's going to be a live conversation talking about creating audience and advertiser dashboards. On the 5th, we're going to be hosting a version of that same council live in New York City. On December 6th, we have the regular deadline for our Jesse H. Neal Awards that I mentioned at the beginning. These really honor the best in B2B media content. December 12th, we have a webinar on getting data to the people who need it most, your business unit leaders. And finally, to wrap up the year, we have the official extended deadline for the Jesse H. Neal Awards. Thank you again to our speakers. Thank you to our audience for joining us today. This concludes the webcast.